In this chapter, we'll see how Bonita can interact with external systems. To do so, Bonita uses what we call connectors. Connectors are basically a piece of code that have some input, will do some processing, and provide some outputs data. We can have, for example, connectors to upload a file to a content management system, call a REST API and get some data, send an email, interact with an Active Directory server, and so on. In Bonita, we provide a set of connectors out of the box for the most common system and common protocols like REST, web services, and so on. But of course, like in many different parts of Bonita, you can extend the solution and you can create your own custom connectors. As I said, connectors is a very simple piece of code. It's actually Java classes with a predefined interface, and you'll see that we have inputs, outputs, and the execution code of the connectors. So you can build your own ones directly from Bonita Studio or using any IDE you are familiar with. If you are not really fluent with Java, you might want to also consider importing existing connectors. You can find several of them on our community website. Also, one thing important when you use connector, we'll see that in a quick demonstration, you can't, for the inputs, use any business variables that your process is using. In the same way, when your connector is done, you can use the output to update your business variables. But if needed, you can pre-process them using some Groovy script. So if you need to adjust the format of the input data or the output data, you can use some Groovy script to do the adjustment layer between the connector's requirements and your process business data. Of course, your connectors can use external library. For example, if you want to connect to SAP, for example, you can include the SAP library to talk with external system and call them from your connectors. So it's some isolation from any classes provided by Bonita, so the connector is executed in a safe environment. Last point I didn't mention is where you can actually trigger the execution of a connector, and you have different options for that, but let's see that in Bonita Studio. So actually, if you have a process like this, if you select the pool, you'll see that in the execution tab, you have the connector in tab here and connectors out here. So basically, connector in will be executed when you start the process. Right after the business variable get initialized, maybe with the user inputs, the connector will be executed. Or they can be executed when the process is finished. So when my process reached the end event, just before archiving this process information, Bonita engine will run all the connector associated with the connector out position here. You can also put connectors on step, like on human step, connector in and connector out is available as well. So connectors in will be executed before the task is made available to the user, and connector out will be executed when the user submits the task. So you get all the information from the user inputs in the forms when you run the connector out tabs here. And of course, it can be executed as well on service task. You have this connector in and connector out option. So now let's have a quick example. I will add a connector here on the start of my process. So when I click on the add button here, the first thing is to select the category of my connector. For example, here I will have a REST API call. And the kind of operation I will do is a get, HTTP GET request. So I select my connectors and then click next. I have this small wizard. So the first step that is common to all kind of connectors is to define a name for the connector configuration. So here I will call a web service to get the weather in San Francisco. So I will put this. And I can put any description, also configure the states to put my process in if the connector failed. So it can stop the process execution and put the task in fail states, or continue through a BPM and error, and so on. So we'll not get into possible option for handling process failure here, but just to let you know that if it's, for example, not a key element in your process execution, maybe you can simply choose this option to ignore the error. So now we start with the configuration of the input of my connector. So in my case here, I will use this web service. It's a public free web service, so I will call this API. Just copy paste here my URL. So this is this part here is an ID of the city of San Francisco to get the weather. Of course, this can come from, instead of having the static value here, this can come from some user inputs that I stored in, for example, some business variable in my process. In the next screen here is some configuration input as well for the connectors, but I will go with default value. For headers cookie, authentication is not required for this web service, and we don't have any specific security configuration nor proxy. And the final screen here is what I want to do with the outputs of my connectors. So for example, for these connectors, I have different outputs. I have the REST API called answer, so the body of the response. I get this in two different formats, as a raw string here or as an object. If it's a JSON, for example, it will be part and an object will be created for me. We also have the request headers, the status code of the response, and the message. So in my example, I will only use the object created for me, and I will use it to update my business variable that I create. And I will update one of the attributes of this business variable. So I will use a Java method here to set the description of my weather. But this response is a complex object, so I need to choose which attribute of this response I want to use. If I get back to the example of the response, you can see here the JSON that is answered to me. So this is a complex object with different attributes, and the attributes I'm interested in is this first one. It's actually an array of the different weather forecast, and I want the weather state name. So in order to pick up the right attribute, I will write a little script. So here I have my object, and so I need to pick up the attribute name consolidated weather here. And I want the first item of the array, and I want the name of the weather. So I will store this just in a temporary variable here. In order to display them in this demonstration, in order to display the content very easily, I will log this information in Bonita engine log file. This is a nice way to trace the execution of your script. You can create a logger. So here I will have one that will put the information in Bonita engine log file. I will use the default name of Bonita for the logger here. But of course you can create different one if you want to put the log in some specific file. And here I will log the weather. Okay, and just as my output here should be a string so I will return the weather as well to update my business variable. So when the connector execution will be done, this little script here will be executed to parse the answer, and we'll log this information in the log file and use the weather to update our business object. So now if I run my process, I will start the process here, and the process execution, actually my process instance should be done. And if I go in administration, here it's another process running, but in the cases, you can look as archive cases, and I can see here it was completed. I can check the overview here, and I can see the value of my business data. So I can see that the value it took was shower, so it's currently running. And if I check the log file, I can see in my log file, sorry, before here, I can see that I have some the weather information here. It was logged as a severe information message in my log file. So here's how we configure a connector. For some connectors that don't have outputs, so for example, in the exercise, we'll use the email connectors, and it doesn't get any output. So when you configure such connector, you don't have this final screen that I got in the wizard where you are asked to do what to do about the output. But all connectors usually have some inputs. Last word about the connectors, and actually not connectors directly, but here connectors let us interact with external system. If you want an external system to call Bonita, for example, to start a process, to execute a task, to send a BPMN message to Bonita, you will use the Bonita REST API usually to do so. So you might have, for example, a Bonita process that do a REST API call that start a long-running operation. Then this operation might call back Bonita later by sending a message to Bonita to ask for the process execution to continue if you want to hold for the external service to be done before continuing the process execution. So that's it for the overview of connectors. You can now proceed to exercise number 5, and we'll continue in the next chapter by speaking about the Bonita applications.